Mohammed and Kim, I wanted to start off with both of you. What are the key elements, language, framing, concepts, or maybe some real-world examples for getting people to understand how immigrants should be considered in other social causes? What should we be talking about and how? Mohammed?
Yeah, no, it's great it's great to be with you all today. I think this is a great question, and Dr. Kim Tabari touched on it, and Kirsten did as well. I'm sure others will over the course of the discussion. The immigrant experience or contribution in the United States is not a monolith, and this is something that we know to be fact. While there might be demographic skews one way or another of who they are and who they aren't, the experiences of immigrants are diverse, right? They're embedded in our communities, they train our factories, they support our hospitals, like what we're seeing right now all across the country. And we have seen this incredibly powerfully, helping to support and sustain our economy, and so many of our systems that are being depleted right now. And across the work of the center, we have found that highlighting these diverse contributions are incredibly powerful examples of expanding the narrative of the immigrant, quote unquote. But I would also like to make a second point, and that is that while immigrants should be seen as powerful levers across social issues, their consideration should also be contextualized and reinforced in a way that I think taps into sort of underlying values of inclusion, right? So that we're able to see their contribution linked in solidarity towards common goals and ideals that we all want to expand. And so it's not necessarily taking less stock in our demographic identities, but it's expanding beyond that and reflecting on how we can really use that as a lever to then exchange in real conversation, in real dialogue, built on real shared common struggle and experience. And this is often where you see real promise, because it moves us away from that sort of demographic silo and into a silo that is less intellectual, less political, more emotional, and it can engage new diverse audiences. And we have seen that in the work that we're doing at the center, but the work that I've done in organizing and beyond that.
Kirsten, do you want to add to that? I'm sorry, Kim, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you for this question. As I shared in my presentation, it's really important to be inclusive in your language when talking about immigrants. So if you're talking to funders or city council members, it's important to talk about the different ethnic groups of immigrant communities that you serve, and remembering that diversity of immigrants is diversity of citizens, and they're impacted by many of the same issues that our immigrant communities face, such as racism, discrimination, and police violence. My second point is that many immigrants are living with at least one US citizen, which we also refer to as a mixed status family or household. And so it's also important to frame that anti-immigration policies impacts them as well. And lastly, during the pandemic, we see that many immigrant communities are struggling because they're unable to work, which means they're unable to earn money, which means they aren't able to pay rent or buy food, et cetera, et cetera. So let's lift up this narrative that many community organizations stepped up with mutual aid and other offerings for immediate help. And California was even the first state that offered $75 million in disaster relief fund to support undocumented Californians impacted by COVID. So all of that framing and all of that positive language is something that we can uplift.
And California is its own case, and it's a little bit unlike the rest of the country. So Melissa, I wanted to turn it to you. One of your polls show that the majority of Americans believe immigrants should have legal representation. But I imagine that your SAFE project encountered a lot of hurdles. How did you overcome those? Give us some tips.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Just at the outset, one of the core tenets of universal legal representation for people facing detention and deportation, which is what the SAFE network advances, is equal access to representation, regardless of merits of the case or prior contact with the criminal legal system. And that's really based on sort of these shared values of due process and justice. And so what we're trying to do in the movement and what we are doing in terms of coalition building and expanding stakeholders is taking an intersectional lens to this work and thinking about the justice system, talking explicitly about race and challenging the criminalization of immigrants and breaking down that pipeline between the criminal, legal, and immigration systems and the harmful notions which our project has had to face along the way, that some immigrants are more deserving of legal protections than others. So the poll that you mentioned, Denzil, really may sound like very surprising at the outset. We found that nearly 9 in 10 people in the United States support government-funded legal representation for people in immigration court. But those, all of us in the field have been talking about this for some time, that there's this disconnect between what we're seeing at the federal level and the shared values and core beliefs that people hold in our communities. Specifically, also, I wanted to pull out that 86% of people in this poll who support government-funded lawyers for people in immigration court support government-funded lawyers for people in immigration court with criminal convictions as well. So we face, in our hurdles, we face public narrative hurdles that we're hoping that this poll and research can help us shift around, like I said, the harmful notion about some immigrants being less deserving than others. And we see those through due process exclusion proposals and et cetera. We're also facing budget hurdles right now in this climate. But what I do think is that the issue and the research shows that it has the potential to unify communities around shared values, and that representation for those in detention and deportation is more important than ever. So we are looking to work with criminal justice advocates, racial justice advocates during this time, as we have been doing over the years in advancing this movement.
And I want to bring it back to you, Kim, and maybe Mohammed, you can chime in as well. You're talking about immigrants are not a monolith. Black immigrants are not a monolith. Deserving versus non-deserving immigrants. Everyone has a particular notion when they hear the word immigrant. But do you think that the national conversation around immigration pushes us to have a reductive idea of who immigrants are and what their lives can be like? And how do you fix that?
Yes, I do believe that the national conversation around immigrants pushes us to think about a certain type of immigrant. I mean, depending on what part of the country you live in, you have a specific image in mind when you think about immigrants. For example, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York from the age of 14 years old, and I lived there until my early 30s. So for me, immigrants were Black, specifically Caribbean folks, right? In my neighborhoods, schools, at the market. So that wasn't necessarily the national, nothing was pushing that other than what I was seeing in my predominantly Caribbean spaces. And now that I live in LA, immigrants are seen here as Latino, right? Especially from Mexico or Central America, with about 2 to 3% Black. So place matters in the narrative. But I want to impress that it's a false narrative, because there are diverse immigrants that are Asian American, Latino, Black, everywhere you go. And so I would offer that we think about ways for immigrants to feel seen, regardless of where they live in the US. So it's up to us, I think, as leaders in this immigration movement, to join with other social justice movements so that we can celebrate and lift up the diversity of our communities.
Mohammed?
Yeah, I think it's an important point. And I think I speak less to the specific kind of reductive narratives of immigrants, say in New York or California or in major cities across the country, but it pits them in an unfortunate corner, and because we're much more than our visible traits, right? We're much more than our gender and our sex and our class and so forth. These are visible traits that often define us, but I think organizing really around shared experience, shared struggle can help us to connect and cross lines of difference in spaces that we would otherwise not find. And so, and it's also an important point of who pushes these narratives, right? Audiences, I do specifically audience segmentation work at the council and at the center. And often these reductive sort of ideas and narratives have such powerful stickiness factors because they're often reinforced in social media, but they're reinforced by the wing audiences. Folks all across the middle, where quite a few immigrants belong, or not belong, but they exist, they're often caught between these poles and caught between these sort of reductive narratives, and just genuinely, that's not who they are. And so for us to be able to break down these us-them silos, we need to be able to recognize that immigrants themselves do not see themselves as being reductive. And so as movement leaders, we need to reinforce the idea that they're much, much broader than that. And their experiences are much more expansive than that.
Yeah. Kirsten, does that resonate with you? And Melissa, tell us specifically, because we're going to run out of time, and I want to get to some strategies and some techniques. What worked, and just what worked and broaden your coalitions? Kirsten?
Yeah, it definitely does resonate with me, and I think one of the questions around what the narrative is that I think we always need to be asking ourselves is who crafted the narrative, who wrote it, and for what purpose, and who benefits from holding on to the current narrative. And so, I think in our work, we're really constantly looking for ways to find a more authentic voice, to bring a more diverse and authentic voice to the table. So knowing that we don't all have the same immigrant story or same refugee story, but that if we allow other people to tell our stories, then we lose track of what the narrative is. So we've done some work in our public health department with bringing in digital storytelling, in first person, authentic narrative voice. And I think that that's something that, we're looking for ways to expand, to really pay honor to the diversity of everybody's story.
Yeah, I'll echo the need to center the voices of those directly impacted by the system in our movement. In our work, in terms of our coalitions, oftentimes labels of criminal or gang involved are used to argue, right, that people should be less deserving of legal protections. And too often, I think we're seeing that the stories and experiences of Black immigrants, and specifically Black immigrants who experienced poverty, interactions with the criminal legal system, police, the many facets of how systemic racism intersect with our immigration system don't get told. And so if our movement is really going to be, make space for these stories and center them and dismantle the narrative and truly be intersectional and achieve lasting systemic change, that's what we need to focus on, is centering the voices of those directly impacted and having sort of the grounding and understanding of the intersection of those systems. And then quickly, I'll just say that in many ways, COVID-19 has really ripped the curtain back on many of these systemic inequities and intersectional inequities as people languish in jails and detention centers across the country, vulnerable to serious illness. And so I think we also have to look at sort of the time we are in right now and the opportunity that we have to talk about the intersection of these issues and collaborate across movements.
Mohammed, we're in crisis mode right now. Tensions are very high. We don't know what's going to be prioritized going forward. So what kind of language should we be using right now? What kind of framing? Can you give us, maybe guide us through a strategy or campaign?
So that's the $1 million question. It's a question that we're trying to answer. And I'm sure, there are a number of organizations and folks trying to answer that very question. And I think I'll offer 3 sort of pieces of guidance here in insights that our research, specifically in our work programmatically, has taught us. One, break down the binary thinking and the narratives that immigrants are reduced under. This can prove real value, especially in recovery. We saw this after Hurricane Sandy here. We saw this after Hurricane Katrina down in the South. Immigrants are not just construction workers. They're not just this. They're not just that. They have real value and expand, and they have, they serve every single part of our economy and our society and our culture. And I think we need to expand beyond the binary thinking that they're often reduced under. 2, we need to explore ways to tap into these underlying values of inclusion so that we're able to tell a story, a common story of who we are and who we can become in solidarity with different groups, marginalized groups, et cetera. And then 3, because it's an election year, but this is less about politics, and more about culture. Those who are often ambivalent about immigrant contribution and the experiences of immigrants are also demonstrating an openness to engage around the issue. And so because they're demonstrating that openness, we need to put our best story forward. And this is a wonderful time to be able to do that. And so if we can, let's consider leaning away from what we often do, which is, rational arguments, and really move into a space that is emotional and that is felt and that is experienced. And I think that's the power of the story that we can tell, especially in a time like this. So those would be my 3 sort of top. So break down binary thinking, tap into underlying values of inclusion, and then consider engaging those who are ambivalent because they are expressing an openness around the issue.
Kirsten, Kim, and Melissa, Wendy did a great job of identifying a lot of the stakeholders that need to be involved in this kind of intersectionality with immigration. List for us maybe some of the surprising stakeholders or partners that you have found in your equity work. Kirsten?
Sure. Well, you know, I didn't get to talk about some of the work we're doing specifically around COVID in New Hampshire that I've been able to be a part of, along with lots of other different partners. And I'm consistently, you know, I'm never surprised to see grassroots organizations come to the table because they carry the burden, they do the labor, they always have, and they always will, and they do it well. We're lucky when they're at the table. But I'm always, you know, I'm pleasantly surprised to now begin to see the addition and the interest of other industries beyond our typical public health industries that we think of, or beyond our social service or healthcare industries, you know. So, you know, business organizations who are concerned, explicitly concerned with social justice issues, and who do want to get their employees back to work, but want to do it in a just and safe and equitable manner, you know, coming to the table. The groups representing workers like unions or other legislative partners or other, you know, I think these are new inroads for us. And I do think that, you know, there is something, COVID really has opened that opportunity for a lot of communities to really come together around one particular issue. And so I think it makes sense. I think that it's also critically important to continue to really center the voices of communities of color and communities of immigrant communities and communities that are marginalized, and not allow those voices to be drowned out by voices that have often had a more robust voice in the political or sphere.
Right. This opportunity, we just recently spoke to a state rep about anti-Asian immigrants, in anti-Asian sentiment, and it led to him proposing we do a survey of minority business owners to find out if they got federal help. So this is an opportunity. Melissa, quickly, some of the stakeholders, and Kim?
Yeah, I mean, UREP coalitions have engaged labor, faith, education, business, and I think increasingly now public health around issues of detention because of the many impacts throughout our whole society that deportations have. But one thing I wanted to just put out there very quickly is that from the outset, when we're building inclusive coalitions and movements, they start, in my opinion, with real allyship and relationships and partnerships that are really grounded in deep understanding and partnership. So when we're talking about sort of reaching out to additional stakeholders and bringing more stakeholders to our movement, I think also showing allyship means more than simply, you know, collaborating. It's showing up, it's listening, and sometimes it's stepping aside and taking action for others.
Kim?
Well, all the stakeholders that were mentioned before is what I certainly support. I do want to add, in relation to the strategies that I mentioned in my presentation, I do want to add that something that I recently read about was something called building a narrative infrastructure. And I believe it was an article written by Othering and Belonging Institute out here at UC Berkeley. And by that, I mean organizing people on the ground and working within various sectors to really develop strategic and powerful narrative ideas, and then immerse them in a sustained series of experiences, really in order to build power, really to build relationships, as Melissa mentioned, right? And so really truly building this infrastructure on narrative, because folks have got Twitter and they've got Fox News and other things to share their narrative, right, over and over all day long. And so I think something that we really need for our intersectional and inclusive movement is this idea of narrative infrastructure. So I will also leave some of the campaigning strategies to the activists and continue to provide data upon request.
So Kim and Kirsten, you see the social vulnerabilities of those you study and those you try to help, but how have you been successfully able to demonstrate to others that these are people that need help, that public health, race, equity, these issues do intersect? And maybe can you give some examples? Someone specifically asked Kirsten to give some examples of where the narrative was positively changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked a little bit about sort of refocusing, you know, that the language we speak in public health is data, but the traditional sort of means for collecting data, quantitative data, clinical data, is not enough really to tell the story. And so, you know, we need to expand that to really be thinking about how are we collecting first-person narrative stories? Where are we doing qualitative data research that includes things like art and music and literature? You know, and I think that every bit of that sort of begins to build or refocus our work around this sort of concept of humanity. And you know, so I think that it's a slow process, but you know, I think that trying to move the sort of social science of public health more to the social and less to the science is sometimes really helpful. You know, so trying to think if there are other, I'll let Melissa answer. I may think of another while she's talking.
Kim, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, so definitely shifting the narrative is not easy, as we all know, right? And certainly we do what we can as researchers to provide the data to help folks that are building those campaigns. But three things that really we found that work for us. One is really collaborating with community and grassroots organizations, right? Because we want them to take the leadership in their campaigns and build power. So our job is to collect, analyze, and present the data to strengthen their campaigns. So our recent report on COVID-19 was done at a request of community orgs that asked us to analyze who are the most vulnerable people in our city. And as you know, folks are doing that analysis all over the country now, right? So really truly collaborating with your community orgs. Second is storytelling, which we've been talking about, sharing personal stories of immigrants, stories of hardship, stories of triumph, right? We like to capture human stories behind the numbers. So for example, our recent analysis around TPS, the temporary protected status, we worked with an organization led by TPS beneficiaries from across the US. I believe it was the National TPS Alliance. We interviewed folks from Nebraska and New York and Texas, focusing on how the impact of TPS on their families, the impact of the current policies, et cetera. Just really important to honor their stories and not just the data. And third, practicing intersectionality. I know it's a buzzword, but really commit to it as an organizational practice even. In your discussion, consider the individual person, their place of origin, their multiple identities, as Mohammed mentioned. Know how immigrants are struggling or thriving in your city, what their healthcare needs are, how the environmental issues play out. Many of them are caregivers, restaurant workers, severely impacted right now. Many have children at home. They have to find a way to do distant learning. What organizations are you connected with, or your organization connected with? It is really critical that we partner with other organizations to help our community and expand our movements.
I need each of you to probably chime into the chat box or just verbally direct us to some examples of narratives that highlight people's stories as well as their contributions. Maybe some good examples, some good campaigns, some good websites that you can think of. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would direct people to storycenter.org. That's a organization in Berkeley, California that we've worked with, and I've worked with extensively around collecting first-person narrative. There are some tremendous digital stories there that people have chosen to share publicly, and there's some great examples there.
Yeah, I'm trying to think internally at the center. One of our pillars, we have 4 pillars of work. One of them being campaigns, and we're actively sort of building some based off of the research and the insights that we're producing. But I think I'll also share, and those are not ready yet for distribution, but I'll also share like the work of our colleague Suzette Brooks Masters, who wrote like what I consider to be sort of a narrative dialogue piece really about immigrants and their positioning and sort of in today's moment. And I think it provides constructive guidance of how to speak about this, specifically when I think talking to sort of ambivalent audiences. But again, it speaks to the core of why this issue is so emotional and the reasons for that, and how we can move beyond that into a more constructive space. Yeah, and I'll share that in the chat box.
And Pablo wants one of you to give an example of a new partnership you built with a non-traditional partner in the immigration movement.
Well, internally, like as my colleague Wendy had mentioned in her keynote, we're engaging the American Alliance of Museums, we're engaging the YMCA, we're engaging people who are anchored in local community because they are coming face to face. It's point of contact, right? It's point of contact care, point of contact service. And we think that because of their scale and because of their size, and also because they reach people in very specific ways, we think they can be powerful levers in the movement and across the work that we do. And so we're very, very happy to have them in our camp. And we're always looking for similar kinds of partnerships who have the kind of scale and reach into communities far and wide. So yeah.
Melissa, I know that this probably happened before you joined Vera, but you'll still engage with a huge array of police chiefs, heads of police departments across the country. Any sense of what that was like, and whether there were any challenges in getting them to acknowledge and respect the immigrant communities, particularly the unauthorized immigrants?
Well, I have less familiarity with that project. I put a storytelling project in the chat box, by the way. But we are thinking, right, like as we are supporting coalitions on the ground for universal representation, we are thinking about various stakeholders, including public safety, law enforcement. What I would say is, and this has been brought up a few times, is that dynamics on the ground and relationships and political realities and coalitions look different in every community. And so we're really letting and trying to empower community groups to drive the coalitions and to drive their relationships with expanded stakeholders like law enforcement. There's different relationships, right, like, and trust levels that exist everywhere. But I do think that they are a valuable stakeholder to pushing back against deportations and increasing access to representation. One of the new projects that we're involving that we just are launching right now is a new grant program for community-based organizations that is seeking to directly fund community-based organizations that are engaged in grassroots organizing around universal representation, but are also geared towards shifting the public narrative about immigrants in detention, breaking down the barriers, and coming up with creative ways to collaborate between the criminal justice and immigration justice systems. And so that sort of, that's the primary purpose, is to sort of empower community groups to build out those coalitions.
Okay, finally, I want to ask each of you before you go, first, thank you very much for taking the time, Kim and Kirsten, to present, and for Melissa and Mohammed for joining this conversation. We got a really great response to some of the questions, and thank you for all the ideas and examples. And Mohammed has been with us on several webinars on changing the narrative around immigration. So I do strongly encourage you to look up those videos on YouTube. If each of you in 10 seconds, starting with Kirsten, can give our attendees one small action that everyone can do to make sure they're incorporating intersectional thinking in their day-to-day work, what would it be? 10 seconds. Kirsten.
10 seconds. I'm going to say pick up a book, look at a piece of art, listen to a piece of music created by somebody who is not like you, and enjoy it and see the beauty in it. And I think when we're able to do that, it is far more difficult to deny each other the humanity that we deserve.
Melissa?
I would say just thinking proactively about how immigrants are impacted differently in all of your respective work and all the different systems, and respecting the voices of those directly impacted in our work.
Mohammed?
Yeah, I would say to continually challenge your work, you know, and if you are not reaching the audiences that you had originally intended to, it might be time to rethink those strategies. And there are ways and there are people who can help you do that.
And Kim?
I would say start with your own organization. Get curious and observe if there is true diversity in gender, age, race, immigration status, and just talk about it. Have an open forum at work to share ways you all are using a racial justice lens in your work. So for example, are you serving Black, Latino, API immigrants? Are you in relationship with BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration? Are you tagging them on your Twitter posts around national immigration struggles? Are you sharing resources so that all immigrants have access? If you're a service provider, are you offering materials in multiple languages to your community? So really do a deep dive in your own organization, because if we have to get that crystal clear for ourselves in order for us to build relationships and build allyship. We've got to get it together ourselves. So if our organizations are not together, then we're no good to one another.
Kim, that was more than 10 seconds, but that's okay. It was incredible advice. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate your taking the time to do this for free for all of our attendees across the country. We really appreciate it. We don't have emojis in the chat box, but I imagine everyone is very grateful and wants to say thanks. So thank you all, Kirsten Durzy, Melissa Garlick, Mohammed, Naeem, and Dr. Kim Tabari. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.